so much for that warm introduction. It's good to be here. I grew up in the East Bay, my first 18 years before finding the other side of the state, or other part of the state, in San Diego, where I've been for the last 27. I was just joking, just about ready to take my native test. I studied 4 hours a night, but they're about ready to let me know who Cabrillo Monument was named after and when Balboa Park was founded. So today we're going to talk a little bit about some research that we completed a couple years ago, just to give you an outline of what I'm going to be talking about. We're going to go through sort of the basic underpinnings of the study design and our results. We'll talk a little bit about, actually quite a bit. I know that there's some flyers around and there's some folks with folks outside. So we'll talk about some of the criticisms and our sort of response to them. We think avenues for additional research that we have. And then we'll finish off with some comments and questions from the audience about the study. So next slide, please. So just to remind you, one of the funny things about this issue is that, and I'll talk a little bit about that toward the end as well, but there are often people don't understand what these are, and that includes elected officials who are voting whether to ban them or to adopt them, project labor agreements. And so the way that we think about them is collectively bargained contracts that establish working conditions and management rights on projects. They usually have at least two major components. Sometimes there are additional ones, but these are the two main ones that they share in common. They resolve labor disputes, and they have a mechanism for hiring labor through hiring halls, and then employment conditions in terms of benefits and other sorts of projects or programs inside the PLA that are designed for workforce relations. They've been used on federal projects at least since 1938. There are big projects built with PLAs. There are small projects built with PLAs. There are big projects built without PLAs, and there are little projects built without PLAs. And so I was just thinking today, one thing, just to remind some of the people, some of the big projects built without project labor agreements include the new expansion at Sacramento Airport, which some of you may have flown through, and San Diego Airport is building its new Terminal 2 without a project labor agreement. I found out doing research to come up here, it's fun because I'm excited about it. The new expansion or renovation of Memorial Stadium will open, we hope, in September with a Bears win against Nevada, and that's a project built with lots of union labor, but without a project labor agreement in place. And in the public realm, there frequently entities will make bidding contingent upon signing the negotiated PLA. So a school district and a trades group will negotiate the contents of the PLA, and then the general contractors that bid will be required to sign on as a condition of their bidding. Next slide. They're controversial. Supporters say that PLAs lower costs, they ensure timely construction, and they increase worker productivity. The argument there is that by avoiding labor disputes, by having a readily available supply of labor, and by having the training program that the trades unions are justifiably proud of, and the quality of workers that go through the trade unions, that you increase that productivity and thus take away any of the costs. Critics argue that PLAs are discriminatory, that they make it very difficult for non-union contractors to bid. They're unnecessary. Many of the benefits are covered by other requirements, and that they raise costs. And it's been one of the central flashpoints of labor issues in California over the past decades. PLAs have been adopted at the local level on major infrastructure projects. The BART expansions, for example, both have PLAs. There have been efforts, principally in Southern California and San Diego, to ban PLAs by local government, and just recently state legislation passed to prohibit local governments from banning PLAs and to incent those local governments to repeal those bans. Just before we move on to that, let me just also say one last thing here. One of the principal reasons we got interested in this, and a number of reasons led me to this, was that in San Diego County, and one thing that Mike didn't say about, one of the things I'm really proud of, I guess, we all have sort of things that we're proud of. I'm proud that when I was at the EDC, I worked diligently as this is funny talking to a taxpayer group about it. I worked really hard to renew, I was the campaign manager, to renew San Diego's half-cent sales tax for transportation, a 40-year half-cent sales tax extension that's going to put over $5 billion into San Diego roadways. We needed to pass it with a 2/3. We did. I overpaid. We were 3,000 votes north of the 66.66 that we needed to pass the measure. And so one of the things I really learned in that campaign was that when you promise people and when you ask them for their money to donate to a campaign, you have some fiduciary trust that, not necessarily in the legal sense, but you have some trust that you have to adopt with. And one of the things that got me interested in this is that in San Diego Unified, they passed a bond extension to do a school renewal. They diligently went out and asked for donations from both merit shop and union contractors, worked really hard to get a 2/3 vote, and then 2 months later they put a blanket PLA on all school construction projects in San Diego County after taking merit shop money for the campaign. And needless to say, that was controversial in San Diego, and personally I also think that's probably something which is a little bit dirty pool once you take public builders' money for a campaign. Next slide. The evidence on PLAs is mixed. Dr. Paul Bachman from Beacon Hill and Suffolk University did the first study that looked at this statistically. He examined school construction in 4 Northeast markets and found, using a fairly small number of independent variables, a positive relationship between the presence of PLAs and increased school construction cost. Dale Bellman, and I know we have some flyers from Dr. Bellman, and I'll be talking a little bit about his letter in a second, later in the presentation. He examined data from Massachusetts. He added more variables to the study, including architectural features and the general contractor's opinions about whether the project was or wasn't difficult, boiler rooms, other steep slopes, and other sorts of variables. And he found no statistical relationship between PLAs and higher costs. Now, I'm going to come back to this at the end, because I think this is something really critics need to address. He also, though, while not finding that PLAs were associated with higher costs, didn't find them associated with lower costs. What he found is that the variable moved in the upward direction, but it wasn't statistically significant. It wasn't so large that it couldn't be explained by randomness and white noise in the data. There have been a number of other studies. UCLA's Institute for Labor Employment, an organization with a lot of backing from the local AFL-CIO in Los Angeles, looked at some case studies along with Fred Coulter from Cornell, but those weren't statistically based studies or examinations. Next slide. So we decided that California schools made a lot of sense, and I'll go through pretty briefly sort of why. There had been no research published on the topic in California. We had a large number of school districts which had adopted PLAs, unlike Massachusetts, where it's largely confined to Boston's unified district. We've got 24 in California. And California already requires prevailing wages on construction projects for schools. Next slide. We also had some additional advantages. The state has a robust public records law. I'm sure the Contra Costa Taxpayers Association, it sounds like you've done a $100,000 club study, can rely upon that to gather information and was not reliant upon interviews. We could send a request in and have the full force of law to get a response. We have a very prescriptive state education code which creates relative uniformity among schools built in California, unlike Massachusetts where there's lots of discretion. In California, we've got a code and regulations in terms of school constructions about yay thick, which say how schools have to be put together. And we have relatively low and no uniformity variance in the prevailing wage across the different regions. So I'm going to come back to this. This was a criticism, and I just want to show some data to get at why we did what we did when we came to prevailing wages and differences, supposed differences in other parts of the state. In May of 2010, then, with sort of an idea that it was an interesting topic in San Diego, hot, that we set out to do that. When we looked at this, and this is important to note, when we did this study, it really became apparent that this was a bear of a work. It was going to require, when we estimated, and we were right, it took about one of my staff guys a full year for data collection and analysis. We realized that was going to take a lot away from other parts and other things that we were doing in the organization. So we approached actually our local chamber first, then the Associated General Contractors, which is an organization that both has merit shop and union contractors in it, and then ABCCCC for some funding. ABCCC, and I know that John Loudon, their new executive director, is here. There's John. Graciously funded, and they covered about a third of the cost of this study. I want to say $30,000, and again, I had a staff member who's fully loaded for about $100K who worked on it most of the entire year. Next. So we looked, our dependent variable, what we were looking to measure was the final cost of construction adjusted using the California Construction Cost Index for back to, these are $2,000 when you look at the numbers, so they're normalized to 2,000. And we gathered the preliminary project information from a source, McGraw-Hill construction data. We looked at new schools built between 1995 and 2003, and we had some focus on larger projects because the proponents of PLAs have argued strongly. Now, PLAs have been pushed further down. We've got actually, I was watching a committee meeting up in the San Gabriel Valley at a city council, and they're talking about putting PLAs on Surrey-Sleal projects that would be under 100,000. But the proponents of PLAs have argued that they're most appropriate and they're going to have the most benefit for larger projects. So we looked at schools with valuation, or school construction projects with valuations greater than 5 million. We found that when we looked at the Dodge McGraw-Hill data, that was about 1,000 districts, and we mailed public records requests, next slide please, to 300 plus districts to ask them about their schools, and you see some of the variables, and we'll talk a little bit more about them, which they were. Next slide. We placed at least, we wanted to be fair, and when I get to one of the criticisms, we'll talk a little bit about that, but we didn't want to feel like we were putting our thumb on the side of one side or the other. So we used a pretty rigorous methodology so that we didn't oversample. So we placed at least 2 telephone calls to the non-responding districts. We would send then a follow-up letter reminding them their obligations under the California Records Act, but we didn't further pester because it was going to be impossible to fairly and equally pester those districts. We verified the data. We found this sort of about halfway through the project. We found that the state actually, at the Division of State Architect, collects a lot of this data as well. We needed to refine it. We were able to use it to reconcile any differences in the data that was collected. And then, again, weighing, fancy social science term, but to disprove or to prove the null hypotheses that PLAs didn't matter, we eliminated PLA projects with extraordinary circumstances and costs. So even though we had data from it, we excluded the RFK High School in Los Angeles and the Roybal Learning Center. That's the Belmont 1, 2, and 3. They rebuilt a high school 3 times in Los Angeles. We removed that from the data. We also removed Eli Broad's most expensive high school in America, built in Los Angeles Unified School District under a PLA. Next project. So this gives you our descriptive statistics. I know this is hard to read in the back, but just to let you know, so we had almost 12% of the schools in our sample were built with PLAs. 60% were elementary. We had a good mix of single versus multi-story, and that's how we coded that data. Most projects, and that's important when we think about when we talk about the regression, almost all the projects done with a PLA were multi-story. About 40% of the total sample was, and about 30% of the non-PLAs. Gyms, pools, whether the project required demolition of an existing structure that was included in the cost estimate, square footage, and then we found, and I think that this is important, beyond the debate about PLAs, so we can have the fight about them. We found that, and we'll get to the results, we looked at age, and one of the things that's pretty clear is that California schools, even after you control for PLAs, are increasingly getting more and more expensive, even after you control for inflation. And I think that there's something for a taxpayer group to ask about, if you will, without being too pejorative about it, the extent to which we may be adding things in our schools that aren't needed, but since we have the taxpayer money, we do so as well. Next. I just wanted to give, this is going to be awfully hard to read from the back, and I apologize that, but I just wanted to let you know the East Bay schools that were in our project. We had 5 from Antioch and 1 from Dublin, 3 from out in Brentwood, Liberty Union High School District, 3 from down in Union City. We had 2 from Oakland, 2 from Pittsburgh. San Leandro was represented in West Contra Costa. So actually in the East Bay, we've got a good mix of PLAs versus non-PLAs. Oakland, Pittsburgh, San Leandro for one of their projects had a PLA, and West Contra Costa has had a PLA. The
total, so 22 schools. The mean or the average CCI adjusted to $2,000 square foot cost on those was $244. And like we found with the rest of the sample, there was a difference between PLAs and non-PLAs. PLAs in the sample in the East Bay, $268.42, and non-PLAs in the East Bay, $225.71, about a $40 difference. But again, and let me make sure that that's important, but again, we have to control for other factors that impact school construction cost. It wouldn't be fair just to take averages, because if PLAs are being done in more difficult circumstances, with more multi-stories, with greater amounts of demolition, we've got to use statistical techniques to control for that. Next slide, Jessica. And that's what we did. We used an ordinary least square model that is a way to use regression analysis to separate out and hold constant those other variables to focus in on the specific one we're interested in, and then ask a question in statistics which essentially comes down to, do we believe the differences that we're seeing are random and simply white noise, or are they so great, and that's going to be a function of the number of observations we have in the study, the number of variables that we're controlling for, and the size of the differences. Are they so great so that we believe that it's improbable that those differences are simply random? So I won't go through all of the statistics here, but just so you know, we found that statistically significant relationships between the presence of the variable and the direction of the coefficient were true for PLAs, which increased costs. The presence of a gym was statistically associated with increased cost. The presence of a pool, the presence of demo, square footage was in the opposite direction, and that makes sense. There's economies of scale that people are able to achieve. As they get bigger and bigger, the cost per additional square foot goes down. And then again, average date was associated with increased cost. Our R squared, which is a measure of our ability to explain a percentage of the variance, was 0.279, not bad for social science. That means that we could explain almost 28%, 27.9% of the variance achieved. Next slide. So in a little bit bigger print so that you can read it, again, we found that PLAs increase costs by $28.90 to $32.49 per square foot, 13 to 15%. We used 4 different regression techniques to get at that, regular, ordinary least squares, and then we did some additional work that was called with weighted regression, which essentially reduces the impact on the statistical findings of outliers. And we know that there's some schools that are really, even though we eliminated some of the really egregious ones in Los Angeles Unified, the weighted regression reduces the outliers even greater, just to ensure that, to make sure we weren't getting our results driven by those anomalies. And that's consistent. Our results are consistent with previous research that found PLAs increase school construction costs by 9 to 20%. That includes Dr. Bachman's study and then Dale Bellman's sparsely specified, he hates when I say that, but his sparsely specified model that also found that. And then again, when he made his model added more variables, the importance of PLAs dropped out for statistical significance. Next slide. And again, that just shows you the rest of it. I've already gone on that. Next slide. So we talk about this in the study, and and this really is where most of the disputes and the differences come in. And I think one of the things that we've really prided ourselves on, we are not a policy shop for hire. About 10% of my funding comes from outside sort of sponsored research. We usually mostly do that because it's interesting projects, and it honestly keeps us just more disciplined by having to meet client needs. I think that that's important for my guys and for me because it keeps us on time. But one of the things that the critics mentioned, and we put it out right there on the study itself, is the challenge with LA Unified. And this is just the limitation of the research. So LAUSD has built projects since 1999,
And then a fancy statistical word, there's a high collinearity between LAUSD and PLAs. What does that mean? That means that out of the 48 schools that LAUSD built in our sample, and LAUSD had not built schools for almost 20 years leading up to their passage of the bond in the late 1990s, where they started, and then they immediately imposed a PLA. 47 out of the 48 schools in LAUSD were built with a PLA. And statistically what that challenges, and again, it's mentioned in a letter that USC put into our study, you can find that on the website, is that high degree of collinearity makes it impossible, or difficult or impossible, I'll talk about how we're trying to tease that out, to reject the alternative of hypotheses. That it isn't PLAs, it's just that LAUSD is totally screwed up and can't build projects efficiently. And I wish we could, USC says the right thing, which is statistically what they should do, is that LAUSD should take 4 or 5 projects and build them in a merit shop way and find out what they find. I give that about as much chance as I do I hate to say it, but Cal beating USC and Oregon this year. But no, it's gonna happen. It's gonna happen. I've got confidence in Tedford. It'll someday happen. I really hope so. I'm taking my kid up to his first Bears game this year. But that's a real challenge. Go ahead, next slide. And so that was the result which really flows into the key criticisms that have been made about our study. There may have been others, but some of them were, bluntly, people were throwing spaghetti against the wall. But these are the 3 that make the most sense. And there are 2 categories of criticisms that are worth talking about. The first, again, a highfalutin statistical concept, but I'm going to try and make it simple. Omitted variable bias, and that's the key element of Dale Bellman's criticism. And then UCLA talked a lot about selection bias. I actually find it offensive what they said, but I do want to talk a little bit about that because people keep saying that that's a legitimate criticism. Essentially, UCLA is accusing 300 school districts in the state of California, about 100 school districts in the state of California violating the law. But, be that as it may. Next slide. So, omitted variable bias, and I just want to make this simple. The claim is an omitted variable bias, a legitimate issue in econometrics, says that there's another explanatory variable driving the observed results. And an easy way to think about that is that the highway between Berkeley and Orinda is really, really expensive. And it's a lot more expensive than the similar square mile or cost per mile of the work that's being done on I-80 between Richmond and Pinole. And it would be then a conclusion that would be drawn, or could be drawn, it would be an incorrect one, would be that Alameda County can't build roads cheaply. As anybody knows, the omitted variable there is the Caldecott Tunnel, which can explain most of the variables. And so the critics argue what we're seeing are not the presence of PLAs, but some variables in Los Angeles. Now, since the high collinearity is present, the way to get at that is to try and tease out what could be those possible things. And they've suggested 3 possible culprits. They've claimed that wages are higher in Los Angeles. I'm going to show you I don't think that's true. They've claimed that LAUSD builds to higher seismic standards. We tested that. And they claimed that the presence of some of the schools in LAUSD doing underground parking drives those results. Next slide. So, and I'm going to have to read this. I apologize, but we wanted to put all the information because I knew my friends from the trades would be here, and I wanted to give them all the data so they could go look for themselves. So we wanted to ask the question, Dale Bellman's purported that California, what we're finding out is just that LA pays its people a lot more than anywhere else, and that's what's driving it. So there are a couple issues with that. I mean, first of all, no one has developed, and they should. Remember, all these projects are done with prevailing wage, PLAs, non-PLAs, union, merit shop. But nobody's put together a uniform index for school labor costs that takes the myriad of trades that are out there, tries to ascertain or weigh them based upon how much labor input would go into a typical school. I mean, sort of what the percentage of carpenter would be, the percentage of plumber, the percentage of electrician, and then looked across the data. Somebody could do that. We knew that if we did that, it would be a year-long study, and the critics that wanted to criticize our study were going to criticize it anyway because they'd say that we didn't understand the difference between a plumber in Sacramento versus Amador County, and that we didn't weigh, you know, it should be 32% rather than 31% for the carpenters, and you know, thus we were just playing dirty pool and looked like a rodent or something. But what I wanted to point out is that here suggests that actually the hypotheses or the data cuts in the opposite way that Dale Bellman says. So I pulled carpenters, plumbers, pipe fitters, and refrigerator fitters, and inside wiremen from the most recent data for prevailing wage for the state of California. And in the case of LAUSD, LAUSD has its own wage table, so I pulled that for there. And so just to read this, in Northern California, carpenters make, again, fully burdened straight time, $55 to $62.48. In LA, they make less, $52.83. Sacramento, which is a good little region for the Sacramento or the Central Valley area, $56.6. So actually, rather than be more expensive, carpenters in LA make less money. It actually works against Dale Bellman and for our hypotheses if we put it in. For pipe fitters or plumbers, pipe fitters, and refrigerators, $79.91 in Contra Costa, LAUSD 62, in Sacramento 61.07. But it gets at one of the issues about trying to put together wages. The craft designation in Sacramento is slightly different than the one in Contra Costa and LAUSD. So you'd have to make judgment calls whether you had the right pipe and plumb fitter that was an apples to apples. And then wiremen, you can see that Contra Costa is the highest, LAUSD is in the middle, and Sacramento. So we could not find any uniformity among the prevailing wages at the index throughout California, so we didn't include it. Indeed, I think their inclusion would bias against the opponents and for our variable because LAUSD pays less. If we adjusted for wages, it would be further enhancing the hypotheses that PLAs increased costs were associated with increased costs, and so we didn't include it. But if the trades want to do this for me, I would be happy to include a wage index that they signed off on in terms of allowing us to compare all 50 counties and to go back about 20 years. So you need to create that matrix for me, and I'll be happy to do it. Next slide. So there were two other purported omitted variables. People said LA, we weren't measuring PLAs, we were measuring the California builds to, or LA builds to a higher seismic standard. We added some additional data. We looked at the Field Act and then AB 300, which tries to measure conformity with the Field Act. And they put every California school into seismic zones. And so we put that variable in. I'll show you those results in a minute. And then the argument was that LA was one of the few districts to build underground parking. So we used Google Maps. We hadn't asked school districts about that when we did it. But we went out to Google Maps and looked at all 551 schools in my sample size. We looked for the presence of structured parking or underground ramps and the absence of surface parking lots. And we assumed that that was a good measure for whether or not they had built underground parking for that school. Next slide. So what we found was when we added that, our R-squared went up a little bit. That suggests that we added some variables that added a little bit of explanatory power. PLAs remained significant. Elementary schools dropped off in importance. Gyms, pools, demos, demolitions, square footage, and that average age, again, remained significant in a statistical way. Next slide. So conclusion, PLAs are associated with higher school construction costs, and we did it across 4 statistical models. The study is the largest and most comprehensive to date in this field of research. We looked at 551 schools. Dr. Bellman's study, for example, looks at about 80 schools in the state of Massachusetts. They're important for California just because we've spent a ton of money on construction of schools in the past decade. It's estimated that there's been about $64 billion in bonds spent on them, and that we've built about 22,000 or 21,000 classrooms. even if you think, well, you know, it's paid for and it's sparsely specified and they have this collinearity problem, I would once again point out this is the third statistical study that's failed to find that PLAs are associated with lower construction costs. As I said before, we're still interested in an acceptable wage data that the trades would buy off on and agree is a fair way. I think there's some reasons why I'm not expecting that, but we can get into that questions. And then we're interested because more districts are adopting this to revisit this question and exclude LAUSD from the analysis. Next slide. So, and we're going to ask questions. I know you've got cards and to fill them out. But let me add, I think, a couple editorial comments here, which I think is reasonable given the big blow up sculpture this morning. I understand, and I know that'll come as a shock because I'm supposedly this paid rat and so forth. I understand the underlying logic of why PLAs are used in certain projects. I can see completely the logic behind why you would use them in the dam projects in the 1930s, and why, when faced with the need to open a theme park on time in the middle of an Orlando swamp, why Walt Disney Corporation would sign a PLA. They are important to provide certainty of labor in difficult construction environments with labor shortages and a critical need to open date, which, if missed, has significant consequences. And that's why some, not the majority, not even a small minority, but some private sector businesses use PLAs. I think the challenge is that we don't use this as, and I think this reflects almost entirely the state of the economy right now, and the fact that California in its construction trades is at a level of activity that approaches or is at the level of the Great Depression in terms of we do a study every month about leading economic indicators for San Diego, and we're pulling fewer building permits in San Diego County than we ever have. We pulled more building permits when they started tracking this. We were pulling more building permits for residential construction in the late 1930s. When San Diego was much smaller and, of course, was dealing with economic calamity than we've pulled in the last few months. We're starting to see a uptick on that. And so I think some of the emotion that's tied to this reflects really challenging times for both merit shop and union contractors and the real difficulties that they face. And I think that the challenging or the sad part about this is that this debate, and again, this is a strange message to bring to a taxpayers group that just, was happy about killing a couple taxes, but that's okay. I can have everybody in the room dislike me. I think that's a sad debate at a time where, for California's competitiveness, it would be great if contractors of all types and trades of all types were pushing the #1 agenda, which is put money into infrastructure and work to rebuild this state because it's important for the economy. But the second thing, and it's the troubling thing, is that, as I said, I can understand the logic behind private companies and even some public entities using PLAs. But as a tool in the toolbox that is rationally considered, I'm afraid that both the banning of PLAs and the adoption of the PLAs is not that, but it is a political exercise. It's an exercise with blow-up rats and flyers and protests and using the politics of those decision makings. And the thing that I think is telling on that is that watching boards that ban PLAs and watching boards that adopt PLAs, and it is clear the elected officials don't have much of a clue what they're talking about many times. They confuse PLAs with prevailing wages. They confuse that PLA bans actually ban PLAs, and they're not just like something. I mean, there's a lot of confusions about there. And my personal view is that I wish that this debate was being waged not in the elected officials and not in the bodies, but with contractors and trades, union and non-union, going to the professional that's in charge of construction in that entity and making a rational argument based upon the nature of the business of what should or shouldn't be done. And that, to me, seems to be a way to get beyond the politics and asking part-time volunteer board members, some which are looking for termed out opportunities at a higher level, to try and make decisions about these complicated construction things. I'm sure I went over. I hope that there's some questions, and then thank you all for staying attentive, and I look forward to the comments and questions.
Erik, thank you, and keep filling out cards. Chris will keep wandering around, and hopefully I'll get these questions right. The first one is a twofer. When you, Erik, pulled your data together, were all costs included, including change orders in construction? And the second part is, was there any look at the building life cycle cost? Was there a savings in maintenance or whatever?
Yeah, great question, and great clarification. So the cost, which is not included in our study, because it would be dirty pool 2, are land costs, the acquisition of the land to build the project. That would be both incorrect and almost impossible, because in some cases these projects are being built on property acquired 100 years ago. In demo. So land costs are not included. Change orders are included. What we did is that the state architects has a field for both cost and then change order cost. If we saw that the response from the school district was at significant variance to the architect's cost, we went back and confirmed that. If there wasn't variance, we went with the state architect's cost and change order cost, based upon the fact that that's self-reported by school districts. They're, force of law that get it right. So that made sense that we use that. We didn't find variance like that very much. And again, when we saw significant variance, San Leandro was one. We went back a few times to try and figure out what was the actual cost they wanted us to use for their 9th grade campus, which was a project built for PLA. And they had told us 41 million. They had told the state architect 23, and ultimately the number that came out was 24 million, which is actually interesting, right? I mean, if I wanted to blow up PLAs, I would have taken the 41 million and been excited about it, but we saw a difference there and we wanted to deal with it. Life cycle costs. Great question. I don't know how we would measure that across all the school districts given the variance by which they would measure that. There's no state requirement to try and look at project life cycle costs across those districts. It's a really interesting question. I know that the proponents of PLAs have argued long and hard that these are of a higher quality construction and thus will save money over the long term. But the problem is that school districts aren't required to report that data, don't use a uniform method to do that. There's actually some interesting stuff in the Financial Accounting Standards Board, FASB, requirements that'll eventually look at depreciation for public assets, but that we aren't there yet, and we're not probably going to be there on any projects built prior to when school districts finally get around to deciding to comply with FASB and depreciate their assets. So no, we don't have life cycle costs in.
And unless I forget, we don't oppose all taxes. I mean, it's just bad taxes. This next question starts off with a compliment relative to the work you've done and the uniqueness of the work. But then it asks, what additional studies would you recommend to inform taxpayers and policymakers about California school construction costs?
So, and I think if you go to our website, you'll find the study. But the two that I think are the best, and I've mentioned both of them, it is useful to read Dale Bellman's study about Massachusetts school construction projects. It's also useful to read them if you know about school construction, some of the variables which he rightly includes for Massachusetts but wouldn't make sense for us to include in our study. Basements. boilers. These are sorts of unique conditions that are required in the Northeast and not so unique in our things. Another example is he includes a variable for auditoriums and NPR rooms. And anybody that has a kid, I've got two, that are in elementary school knows that NPR, multipurpose rooms, are ubiquitous in every elementary school and high school and middle school in California. So that would be a variable which would have a big old 1 for every one. He includes it because there's apparently variation in Massachusetts. So Bellman's study, and then I'd read Bachman. And Bachman from Suffolk University, and then importantly, if you're really excited about this stuff and you're looking to do your master's in econometrics, it's important to read his response to Bellman, where he talks, and I think really legitimately, about whether you can have such a richly specified model like Dale Bellman produces, and actually find statistical significance on anything, given the relatively low number of schools that Bellman looked at. And that's a fun discussion. We can have it if people are stats geeks here in a little bit, but it's an important and I think actually troubling criticism of Bellman's work that he has yet to sort of respond to.
Other than least squares, can you explain multiple regression? No.
I'll try. My students will help if I can.
Why do PLAs cost more? Higher wages, more hours spent, higher cost of materials, higher benefit loadings.
All right, so, and this is really important. I don't want there to be any misunderstandings. We didn't look at the why. So I could conjecture, I could speculate why that association is, but that was not the purpose of the study. The purpose of the study was to ask whether they are associated. My belief is, without testing it out, is that the challenge for PLAs in California, wages aren't a difference here because everybody has to pay prevailing wages, so that's not the issue. My belief, which I'm not sure even how you would construct the test to try and find this out, is that it's the additional things that are required, and principally the payments into the vesting pension plan and the vesting health care plan that many of the non-union trades members never work enough hours to vest into. And so, you know, if I'm a smart labor guy and labor economist, I would think, well, that's being made up somewhere else in the bidding, because those are wages which have to go into the bid but are never realized by the labor. So you have to make up for it somehow. And that likely drives some of the increased cost. But again, that wasn't the purpose of our study. Our purpose of the study was just to look at whether there was an association. So anything about, you know, sort of the why would be speculative. There has been one study that looked at bidding, and the interesting thing there is that bidding, the number of bidders went down, but the study said that didn't go down so far as to make a likely difference in the outcome. But there could be that too as well. But again, that wasn't the purpose of our study.
There might be a bias in this, but I'll read it as it's written. Arcane statistics and statistical concepts are so embedded in the discussions pro and con in PLA. How does the average person reach a rational conclusion?
Well, I think that so I appreciate, both from an audience and from policymakers in particular, that what this debate sometimes devolves down to is dueling academics and study A versus study B, and who's paid for and who isn't, and who did this and who did that, and who's got better press. But here's, I think, the layperson's argument, and actually my father, my late father, who was a professor at UC Berkeley, who was, you know, not to brag too much, but you know, was an important person in the development of something called meta-analysis in public health, which is taking multiple studies and looking at them. The first cut you would do in meta-analysis is you would look at the overarching results and see if they skewed one way. And the one thing we don't have is we don't have any statistical studies which show that PLAs reduce costs. We have studies that show that they increase cost, and we have studies that say they don't increase cost so much as to be statistically significant. So I think that the layperson at least needs to consider this, which is that arguments that they lower cost seem not to be supported by studies which have looked at large number of cases and done it in a statistically rigorous way.
We have three. You and I keep doing that.
Sorry, me being short, I'll just put on my stick.
We have three on one card, and you may have already addressed some of these, and some of it might be outside of your study area, but I'll go ahead with the question anyway. How are PLAs consistent with the written schools procurement policies and procedures? What are the bid rigging / bid suppression concerns from PLAs? And then lastly, is there a correlation between PLAs and quality of work? And I'll leave these three questions up here since they're very disparate.
You know, we'll get, and then I'll push it back. So we're not lawyers, and I didn't stay at a Holiday Inn. But it is my understanding that the courts have ruled from the Boston Dig project on that PLAs are consistent with the vast majority of procurement policies and procedures that public entities have, that they are a tool and that they are allowed by both state and federal law. The question two, what are the bid rigging? The argument, again, not in our study. There's been one study that's looked at this kind of, you know, okay, is that that non-union contractors faced with the compliance issues, the issues about only being able to bring a small number of core employees directly to the work site and then hire the rest through hiring halls, and potentially the need to double pay not equivalent benefits. I mean, I'm not going to argue here for a moment that the healthcare plans or the retirement plans offered by most merit shop contractors are comparable to the trades. But that some element of double bidding keeps non-union contractors from bidding. And then, is there any correlation between PLAs and quality work? I don't know how to measure that. I think that if you ask any school district in school district construction official that we were surveying, they would say that their school is of Lake Wobegon quality. Everything's above average here, and it's the best school, you know, that anybody could ever possibly buy. It's a really interesting question, but you know, the one thing that I guess, you know, in this debate, there's lots of stuff that's sort of, you know, bandied about, and I have no idea how you test that. You know, you could do it anecdotally, and so, you know, I'm sure, I don't know, we probably don't. I was really hoping we would get some, and maybe we do. If there anybody, maybe we can even go off card, some school district people. I am sure that San Leandro would come in and tell you the horror stories about building their project without a PLA and why they put the 9th grade campus with a PLA and how they thought it was the best thing ever. My story on that, you know, because we all have dueling anecdotes in this debate, unfortunately. You know, so I had a phone call during the study, we just released it 2 days later. I had a phone call from the Santa Ana district superintendent saying, I got to talk to you, your data's screwed up. I said, oh God, you know, not good news. And I said, call him up. He says, you have us listed as a PLA. We're not a PLA. And I said, well, now just a second here. Here's why we think you did a PLA. He said, oh, okay. Now I understand. You were looking at before. We had miserable experiences with our PLA, and then we had one board member who really pushed it, and we rejected it, and our new schools are being built, but they fell outside the timeline. So, you know, the problem with quality of work arguments is that there's no good way to measure it across time and across school districts, that it's subjective. And everybody, if you ask them, will say that their school is the best thing ever built, and that they've got, you know, a wonderful learning environment for their kids, and that, of course, they did a great job in building it. So that's my answer there on quality.
Does this remind you of like the Oakland Speaker Series, or are we do the, anyway. Have you ever seen a PLA driven by any group on a public project that was not a union, say a Chamber of Commerce or a taxpayers group?
So my interest in this issue, I told you sort of the origins of it. I believe, now the unions, the trades were integrally part of this, but I believe the expansion of the Levenheim Dam, which is a big project in San Diego County that was done with a PLA, did not generate from the non-union contractors any opposition, and I believe was supported by the Association of General Contractors and the San Diego Chamber of Commerce when it moved forward. And again, I go back to the comments, and I know, you know, again, I'm making everybody mad. I think that it didn't engender that opposition because the Levenheim Dam project moved forward when there was work for everybody. Nobody was suffering. And you can make, even as somebody who's skeptical about the cost issues, I can make an argument for that. It was a project that was in a really difficult way. They had to build an access road. It was one of the few packed earth dams we've done in a long time in this state. And I think the first one we had done in San Diego County. And again, a PLA was put in that place. And I don't know if the PLA was supported by the Chamber of Commerce and the San Diego Taxpayers Association, but I know they didn't oppose the emergency water storage plan, which the Levenheim Dam is part of, and I believe may move forward. I think what makes taxpayer groups and chambers the most frustrated is PLAs on Surrey Sleal projects. I mean, I think that it is, and again, our own data, 88% of schools in California have been done without them. And I think what makes people, and San Diego Unified's a great example, we have PLAs on $200,000 AV rewiring projects because they put a blanket PLA on this bond, and it was done sort of just, you know, I think for some political reasons. And that, I think, what makes people just scratch their head because they don't see complicated projects. They don't see a dearth of labor that's available. They don't see the need for sort of some of the construction management tool. There may be all the other supposed benefits, helmets to hard hat, training apprenticeships, local work hires, and so forth. But at least in terms of the principal argument that's been made in construction, big projects, complicated, labor shortage, get your guys there, get it done on time because it's the tool to do it that way. The move to push PLAs lower and lower on the cost scale has been one that I think has really riled people's in skepticism about the tool and how it's being used.
For the most part, I've been taking asking the questions in the order that the cards came in, but you just mentioned helmets to hard hats, and one card has that question, and I'm saving a very special one that's highlighted for the end. Have you seen in Brentwood, and Brentwood is one of the places that they talked about the helmets to hard hat focus, have you seen in Brentwood or anywhere else that a PLA was used where a PLA was used that these goals were actually accomplished?
Why don't you explain what that is for somebody?
Yeah, I can. Yeah, absolutely. So the argument that's been advanced as not new argument, but an argument that's been advanced by proponents of PLA is that in addition to a construction management tool, there are other benefits that a public entity can write into the PLA that produce or provide outcomes which the proponents argue are beneficial. The three that have been sort of noted often are increased health and pension benefits, retirement benefits. The second one that's been argued about is actually four, sorry for that. The second that's been argued is apprenticeship programs. Argument made that the trades do a better job in terms of apprenticeship programs, and that to build the next workforce of construction workers, we need PLAs to put in place. The third argument that's made is that there are special populations, minorities, women-owned contractors, minority and women trades, and then as well veterans, newly discharged veterans, and that PLAs can write into them mechanisms and means to put that labor forward. And then the fourth argument that's made on those additional benefits are local hire requirements, that a certain amount of the trades will come from certain zip codes and more will come from other zip codes. So the data is just starting to roll in. We didn't look at it in our study. Many cases, the districts don't track that information. I'd have to think really hard whether you could, in a big case in fancy statistical word for number, a project like ours that looked at 551, if you could even look at and get at that data. But here's some of the anecdotes that we know. We know that the local hire requirement at the Berkeley PLA has been a disaster. I think 2 Berkeley residents have been hired in there, and that makes sense. Construction workers don't. I grew up there. Not a lot of construction workers live in Berkeley anymore. In San Diego Unified, they didn't hit their local hire requirement. They had some positive news on helmets to hard hats, but wasn't great. And then I know that LAUSD is doing did I think a preliminary study and then doing some more work. But it's not clear that, again, their problem is going to be is what do you compare it to? I mean, they're going to have all their projects are going to be PLA, and they're going to show that they hit some number. And the problem with that is that we don't know whether a bigger number or the same number or a slightly smaller number would have been hit by the merit shop community just in the normal course of doing business. So there's not yet great data developed on those additional outcomes. Editorialize for a minute. I'm not sure that's what school districts need to be in the business of doing. My wife's a teacher. She's going to teach a classroom of 37 kids next year. And my first grade son will be going into a class with, I think, class sizes of 32. My daughter will be in a class size of 31 as a kindergarten. And she's got some special needs. Not bad, but a little bit of special needs for where she is. God, I know as a taxpayer, that's where I want to see my money in schools go to teachers and staff and classrooms, and because here's the thing, and especially if somebody wants to argue, well, it's 2 pots of money and we can't. Taxpayers don't care. They look at their bill at the end of the year and they say how much they're spending. And at some point they say, well, we've given at the office. And they don't want to care, and nor do they know, nor should we expect them to know about the minutiae of flows of money and the difference between capital improvement projects and operating costs or whatever else it is. Yeah. And my concern, and again, I say this to a taxpayers group. So again, I think by the end, the taxpayers are going to chain me up on the rat. I'm a believer in parcel taxes. I think we have to invest in our schools. And I'm deeply concerned that the debate about these things, and by the way, it killed the parcel tax in San Diego Unified. The debate foreclosed it. Now, my kids go to a district that's north of San Diego Unified, but the debate about PLAs and the division about PLAs at San Diego Unified meant when they went to the voters for a parcel tax, and God, they need it. They're going to lay off 1,800 teachers next year, is that they got trounced. And a large part of it could go back to when you polled voters and they said, well, we think they're screwed up. They obviously can't manage their money. There are all these conflicts. Why should I give them more money if it seems like they can't work their house out for order? So again, the editorial comment on that is that those things may be true. They all may be beneficial. I'm not sure they're the purpose of why we give tax money to school districts, which to me seems to be about educating kids and using every dollar we can to get it into the classroom.
Okay, we promised to have everybody out of here or be done by 9:30. I'm going to read the last two before the last question. And you have 30 seconds. Did you or can you look at what percentage of non-PLA jobs were built by union contractors? Are there enough data points to compare PLA versus non-PLA by geographic area?
So first one, I only have 30 seconds. No, but it's a good question on union versus non-union. We couldn't do it in our study, but I absolutely believe that now with more knowledge in a shorter period of time, one could go back. LAUSD though keeps really miserable records, so you got to think about how you deal with LAUSD and getting information out of that. I think the trades could do it. I mean, I think the trades would probably get that information out of LAUSD a lot easier than anybody else. The second question was geographic issue. God, we looked at trying to parse geography all over. You know, we looked at it, we tried to do it, but we didn't have the kind of differences and distribution of PLA projects that would have allowed us to do that in really any systematic way. We excluded LAUSD. I'm happy to talk about what happens when we excluded LAUSD. We still found a statistical significance, but our model fit went down significantly. And again, I think that's because 2/3 of the projects in our sample were LAUSD, and so with just that few, we didn't have a good explanatory power.
And we'll end on this question. Who will make the top 2 in the San Diego mayor's race?
Oh, wow. You know what? This is good, and maybe they can, because I know they'll probably want to make a comment about this, and they should. I mean, they've been, God, I just want to say, actually, the trades, look, I know this is a painful issue, and it's one that you guys, you know, I know are really, I'm sure everything you've said today, or lots of things I've said today, just had you clinched your gut, and so you should have an opportunity to talk a little bit. But I think really this is a question about, for San Diego, it's whether the unions spend money to support Bob Filner. If they do, Bob will be in the runoff, and then I think it's between Nathan and Carl DeMaio, Nathan Fletcher and Carl DeMaio if they do. If the unions don't spend money and so far they haven't in support of Filner to any great extent, I figure that it's DeMaio and Fletcher. And that's largely because Bob, Congressman Filner, hasn't run in the city of San Diego except for a very small part in the South Bay for 25 years. And so a lot of the voters that vote a lot in primary districts that are up in the northern part of my city haven't voted for Bob in 2 decades, 3 decades. And so his familiarity to them is limited.
Erik. Thank you.
Oh, thank
that
you.
Was great. That was wonderful.
I wanted to thank Mike Vukolich for the lovely flowers, and please take them home. We also want to thank ABC for sponsoring this meeting, and remind you all that we will be having the fire chief on June 29th. So we will see you then. Bye.
Great speaking.